Hey, good morning, folks. It's Pastor Stephen here, back again with another No Frills daily devotional. And today's lesson is titled, Who's the Boss? All right, I promise this isn't a tribute video to Tony Danza for those of you that grew up in the 80s like I did. But I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like this where there's tension in trying to figure out who is actually in charge in a certain situation. Sometimes it happens in my classroom. I work with a co-teacher and she's in their classroom in the morning and I'm in the classroom in the afternoon. But there's this 11:55 overlap where I come on the scene and she is getting ready to leave. But when we're both in the classroom, sometimes there's tension for our kiddos to try to know who's actually in charge right now. That teacher's leaving, but this teacher is here. And sometimes that tension can cause those kids to get a little squirrely, okay? And so sometimes that happens in our life, okay? I don't know if that's ever been the case for you where there's this tension between you and God and trying to figure out who's actually in charge right now in my life. Is it me or is it you, God? Right? And that's kind of what I want to hit at today, because we've been talking about parallax error, believe it or not, and how my experience of God, how I experience him, can be affected by my perspective, and my perspective can be affected by my position. Let me just clarify that if you haven't watched any of the previous videos leading up to this one, where how I position myself, where I put myself in terms of authority in my life is going to determine my view, and my view is going to determine my experience. And so if I position myself above God as his boss, then I'm going to be looking down on his actions as his judge, which then is going to determine the experience that I have in my relationship with God. But I would argue that our position is not above God as his judge. His position is meant to be above us, okay? And so there's this tension, imagine it like this. Think about going to a restaurant, okay? You walk into the restaurant, the hostess brings you to your table, you sit down, and the waiter comes up and he tells you, "Excuse me, sir," or "ma'am, but you're in my seat." And then he makes you stand up, and then he sits down in your seat and demands that you serve him, right? How weird would that be, right? That would be really weird, okay? But that's kind of what we tend to do with God. Where in American Christianity, we invite God into our lives, but then we expect him, if he wants to stay part of our lives, we expect him to serve us, right? I could ask a question like this, in your relationship with God, are you the dictator or are you the servant? Well, the easy answer, right, the Sunday school answer would be, well, I'm the servant, Pastor Stephen. But then if you take a look at your life, is that really what you believe? Because if you look at your life and it seems like you're functioning more as the dictator, okay, you'd be like most other Christians because that's what we tend to invite God into our lives, but he can stay there only as long as he's willing to serve me and my needs and my desires and my wants. But that's not the gospel, okay? The gospel is I've been invited into God's life and I'm going to serve him. Okay, and so there's a challenge though, and there's a tension, because I've used this verse before. It's Isaiah 64, verse 4, and it's just talking about how no eye has seen, no ear has heard of a God who works on the behalf of those who wait for him. So in that verse, it seems like, oh, well, God serves me because he's working on my behalf. But you got to remember the key part of that verse is he works on behalf of those who wait for him, or those who wait on him. Whereas I serve God, okay, there's some tension here. Do you serve God so that he serves you? Yes and no. We don't want to leverage our relationship with God so that he serves our needs. What the Bible would teach us though is that as you serve God, okay? As you serve God, your needs do get met. And not only that, but your needs and your desires, they get transformed, all right? And so I've been on this kick of how can we have two opposing views of the same God, right? And it's based on my position. It's based on my perspective because those are going to dictate my experience. And I want to show it to you in scripture today. This is Isaiah 65, and I'm going to read verses 13 through probably verse 15, okay? And I want you to see what is happening here, okay? And so this is God speaking, and Isaiah's writing down his words. He says, "My servants will eat, but you will go hungry. My servants will drink, but you will go thirsty. My servants will rejoice, but you will be put to shame. My servants will sing out of the joy of their hearts, but you will cry out from anguish of heart and wail in brokenness of spirit." And what we see here is there's this juxtaposition again of my servants are going to have this kind of experience, but you're having this kind of experience. My servants are having this kind of experience, but you're having this kind of experience. And what I see in this scripture and what I'm trying to communicate through this video today is this idea that if your experience of God, okay, isn't what we talked about last time where he's a God who's gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love, okay? And his nature never changes. But if that's not your experience, there must be something wrong with where you've positioned yourself. And maybe you're positioning yourself above God as his judge. Maybe you think that you're serving God, but really you're taking on the role of the dictator in your life and in your relationship with God. And so if your experience, okay, if your experience of God isn't that of what a servant's experience is, then I would challenge you and encourage you today to take on the role of God's servant and not as his boss, right? This is the question or the thought that I've been challenging myself with, right? If that's not my experience of God, then something must be wrong with my perspective. And if there's something wrong with my perspective, then there must be an issue with where I've positioned myself. And so the challenge for myself today and the challenge for you is to take a look at your life and think, am I taking on the role of a servant or am I taking on more of the role of the dictator in my relationship with God? And when I humble myself and position myself under his authority as his servant, I can see clearly in Scripture that my experience is going to be far different than what it's been so far in my life. Hey, you guys, have an awesome, awesome day. Be blessed.